It's kind of chilly now. It's kind of chilly and a bit cool in Iran, also in Ankara.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Jeff, for accepting to do another session with us. This is great. I don't have enough words to thank you for this.
It's always a pleasure, Amir.
Thank you, Jeff. I mean, for the young teachers who are with us tonight, I know this is an unforgettable experience, and the learning will be immense for all of us.
Well,
Look, I've been in your sessions for like a couple of times, but I was still looking forward to this session with a lot of passion and enthusiasm.
Amir, you already know everything. There's nothing for
there are lots of
nothing for
things
you
I
to
still
learn.
need to know, Jeff. There are lots of things. I was going through the article the other day, the article that you shared with us. I read the article and lots of things were still new to me. And I was looking at some things from different perspectives and they were wonderful. So thank you so much for sharing the article and thank you so much for accepting to do a session with us tonight. So like you know, I've told you before, people who are here with us tonight, they are young teachers. They are usually beginners in teaching. They have a long way to go, but they are so lucky to be here tonight to sit your session, Jeff. Jeff, I've shared your bio with everyone and they have read about you. So that's why I'm not going to read the bio once again. So the floor is yours, the session is yours, and we're all ears.
All right. Thank you, Amir. Well, first of all, put on my other glasses here. I want to welcome everyone and thank you for coming tonight. I know it's nighttime and you would probably rather be doing something else. So I appreciate your attention tonight. My name again is Jeff McQuillan, and I'm coming to you from Los Angeles, as Amir mentioned. I've been teaching in second language situations for 30, 40 years, most of my career. Even though I'm only 29, I've been teaching for 30 years, so you can figure that out. Tonight we're going to talk about some what I call fundamentals of language acquisition. So these are the basic principles, at least from one perspective, of how we pick up new languages. And as a beginning teacher especially, it's really important for you to understand what are some of the, we could call them theoretical principles behind language acquisition. A lot of beginning teachers, they just want to know how you do it. What do I do in the classroom? What do I do next? What activities should I use? These are really good questions, right? And Amir and the other wonderful teachers you have there will help you with those things and have helped you with those things, I'm sure. But in order to understand if something is working or not, you have to understand the basic theory of how we pick up languages. Because if you have the wrong idea, you might think something is working, but if you don't really understand what the results should be, how things should actually look like, you won't be able to understand whether you're doing the right thing in the classroom. So although it's easy to think that at the beginning, there's no connection, there's theory here and there's practice here and there's no connection. In fact, those two things are very closely connected. Understanding the why helps you understand the how, okay? So if you know why we're doing things, then you can figure out by yourself or by looking at other teachers or by reading how you actually do the things that you need to do to help your students be successful in your classroom. All right, I'm going to talk about 5 different fundamental or basic ideas, or we could call these hypotheses, because in science, we use the word hypothesis to mean it's our best guess, right? You probably know that in science, we're never absolutely 100% certain about most things. What we do is we have a hypothesis, we have a guess, and then we see whether that guess is correct. And that's what scientists do. They have ideas, and then they find evidence to support these ideas, or they find evidence that this idea is a bad idea, and they throw that out and they come up with a new guess, a new hypothesis. Well, we're going to talk about 5 hypotheses, 5 of our, we could call these our best guesses about how language acquisition works. And these 5 ideas come from a scholar, a professor here in Los Angeles, actually in California, by the name of Stephen Krashen. And I was Stephen Krashen's student many years ago. So just like you are a student of Amir and your teachers there, I was a student of Stephen Krashen. And so I'm going to talk about some of his ideas to give you at least one way of thinking about how you can help your students, the why of language acquisition. Okay, so let's start with our first big idea. And the first big idea is the difference between acquisition and learning. Now, these are terms that are, we could call them technical terms in English, because we're going to use them in a very specific way. When people talk about language learning, they mean a lot of different things. But I'm going to give these 2 words, acquisition and learning, some very specific, we could call them technical definitions. When I say learning, I mean conscious knowledge of language. You see, your brain has 2 different ways of storing language information. Inside of your brain is a part of your brain that is we say dedicated or is made for acquiring or picking up languages, okay? So knowledge is stored in your brain in 2 different ways. One way is what we call learning, and learning is conscious knowledge. So conscious knowledge is knowledge that you can write down. These are the rules that you study in grammar. For example, in English, the plural is usually formed by adding an S at the end of a word. So I have 1 cup, and I have 1 glass, and I have 2 drinking vessels, all right? 2 things I can drink from. The 2 vessels has an S at an end. I have 1 pen, 2 pen. I have 2 pens, right? Okay, this is easy, right? You all know that. This is very easy, basic English. But that knowledge that you form a plural, that you create the plural with an S, is conscious knowledge. You can study it, you can write it down. It's something that usually you study in a language class when you're studying rules of grammar, for example, or rules of punctuation. Okay, so language has lots of rules, and you can study some of these rules consciously. But there's another kind of knowledge that your brain holds. There's conscious knowledge, but there's also unconscious knowledge. Unconscious knowledge is knowledge that it's in your brain, but you don't necessarily know it's there, and you don't necessarily understand why you understand it. For example, if you're a little baby, when little babies are born, right? Their mother speaks to them and their father speaks to them, and the baby eventually starts acquiring language. The baby is not getting conscious knowledge. The mother is not saying, okay, Amir, S is the way that we add to what we add to the end of the word to form a plural. No, right? You don't teach rules to a little baby. You just talk to the baby, okay? And the baby acquires language unconsciously. The baby doesn't study. You don't give a baby a grammar book and say, study these rules and I'll test you tomorrow. No, right? All of us, when we were born with our mothers and fathers, we acquired language unconsciously. In fact, you have so much language that you don't even know the rules that you know, right? If I asked you, if you go and ask somebody, well, why in English do we use this rule versus that rule? Most people don't know, but they can understand it and they can speak it, they can write it, they can use it 100% correctly without knowing any of the rules, okay? So 2 ways of knowing language. Learning, conscious. It's something that you can study, something you can write down. Usually you do this when you get to school. So when you went to school, when you were a younger child, when you were, I don't know, when you start school, 5, 6, 7 years old, the teacher maybe taught you some rules of Persian, rules of your language, right? But you already knew a lot of Persian before you got to school, right? That kind of knowledge that you knew before you got to school is what we call acquisition. It's unconscious knowledge. So there are these 2 separate ways of knowing language: unconscious and conscious. Acquisition and learning. Okay, we all agree that you have these 2 kinds of knowledge. You can have knowledge of language, both acquisition and learning. So for example, I know how to use the 3rd person singular verb in English. Once again, just like the plural, to form the 3rd person singular, he goes, he runs, he walks. What do? You add an S at the end. Okay, that's the rule. I know that rule consciously because I was an English teacher, okay? And I would teach that rule to my students. I also know that rule unconsciously. I can have the same rule in both language systems, okay? And that's really important. Why? Because some people, like little babies growing up, or people who have never gone to school, all of their language knowledge is acquisition. It's all acquired. They may go to school later and learn some of the rules that they already acquired, and then they could have both language and learning and acquisition. But you can have all acquisition. You can also have mostly or all learning. You can study the rules of a language, but then when you try to speak it, nothing comes out. Or you try to understand it, you can't understand it. Acquisition is the one that we use without thinking about it, okay? Now, which of these 2 is more important, acquisition or learning? I think you probably know already, just because the way I've been describing it, that acquisition is the most important knowledge you can have, the unconscious knowledge. And the reason is that most of the language that we use, 95% of the time, right now, when you're listening to me talk, or when you read the article, you're using 99% of the time your acquisition, your unconscious knowledge. How do I know that? Well, because as you're listening to me, you're not stopping and thinking, oh, he said a past tense verb there. Yeah, that's right. It was past tense. No, you just understand what I'm saying without having to think about it. That's using your acquisition. So 95% or 99% of the time, when you're speaking and when you're listening, when you're writing and when you're reading, you're using your acquisition. So acquisition is the most important kind of language we can have. Now, here's the bad news. The bad news is you can't study for acquisition. You can study for learning, right? Tomorrow I could give you a test on the 3rd person singular S and the plural S in English, and you can go home or you can go into your bedroom and you can study the rule, and tomorrow I can give you a test and you can get 100% on it. That's learning, that's conscious knowledge. But acquisition is not something that you can study for consciously. It's something that we get in a completely different way. How do we get acquisition? Well, wait, I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. It'll be our little secret for a couple of more minutes. But right now, I want you to understand is that there are these two different kinds of knowledge, learning and acquisition, and that acquisition is the most important kind of knowledge that we can give our students. Now, the question is how we give them that knowledge, and I'm going to tell you that in a few minutes. Okay, a couple more things before we leave acquisition and learning. Learning does not become automatically acquisition. And acquisition does not automatically become learning. In other words, just because you know the rule for, say, third person singular S, he goes, she walks, he runs, and so forth, right? You know that rule. You can know that rule, but you won't necessarily acquire that rule automatically. In fact, there are people who speak English as a second language and have lived in England or the United States or Australia for 20, 30, 40 years. And still, after 30 years, when they speak using their acquisition, using their unconscious knowledge, they make a mistake on the third person singular S. How is that possible? They know the rule. If you ask them, what's the rule for the third person singular S? They know it. They know the add an S. But when they actually speak, or perhaps when they're writing an email, they get it wrong. Now, why do they get it wrong? I'm going to tell you that in our next big idea, okay? But for now, understand that just because you study over and over and over and over again does not mean it's going to become acquisition. Why? Because these are two separate systems in your brain. These are two different ways of knowledge. And just because you have one doesn't mean you have the other. Okay, so learning does not become acquisition. Let's move on to the next big idea. And this is number 2. The next big idea is something called the natural order hypothesis. Now, we just talked about the third person singular S, right? He runs, she runs. And I said that you can know that rule consciously, but you may not acquire it. Now, why do some people never acquire that rule? Well, this second big idea, the natural order hypothesis, explains why we acquire some things unconsciously and not others. Here's the idea. For reasons that we don't understand, okay, and that's really important to understand, there are a lot of things about language acquisition that we don't understand, that linguists like myself or linguists that are studying in Harvard and the universities in Tehran and in Oxford and in Cambridge, there are things they don't understand about language still. And this is one of the things that we still don't understand why, but we know it's true. We know that it's probably true. Okay, it's hypothesis. So when I say it's true, I mean it's probably true. We have evidence that shows that we think it's correct. The natural order hypothesis says that in every language, there are certain grammatical structures that you pick up quickly, right away, or within the first, say, month or two. And there are other grammatical structures that we pick up after a long time. And there's what we call a natural order. Some of these are really easy, and some of them are what we say are late acquired. Now, let me clarify. Let me say, we're talking now about acquisition. We're not talking about learning. You can learn the rules of English in any order you want. You could start with the past tense rules. You could start with the present tense rules. You could start with the the plurals. You could start with how we form contractions. Okay, you can study those rules in any order. but you acquire those rules unconsciously in a certain fixed order. And there's nothing you can do to change that order. Now, every language is different. English has a natural order of acquisition. Spanish has a natural order of acquisition. Persian, Farsi has a natural order of acquisition. We don't actually know the exact order, but we know that there are some things that are quickly acquired by your brain and some things that take a long time. We don't know why. I'm sorry. I wish we knew why, but we don't know why. It's not because one rule is simple, because what could be simpler than the rule for the third person singular S in English? It's a very simple rule. You can teach your students that rule on the first day of class. But they may learn the rule, but they won't acquire that rule. It will take them a long time to acquire that rule. Why? We don't know. Now, this is actually good news, because there are some people, when they are acquiring a new language, they get frustrated. I know that rule, but then when I tried to use it, I got it wrong. Why? Your brain, the language acquisition part of your brain, we sometimes call it the language acquisition device, it's built a certain way, okay? There's nothing you can do about it. There are some things that are going to come quickly and some things that are going to come late. In English, for example, the plural S comes fairly quickly. So does the ing form. So I am walking, W-A-L-K-I-N-G. That ing, the use of what's called the present progressive, that is acquired fairly quickly by acquirers. The third person singular S could take forever. You could never get it. Okay, some people never get it. They never acquire it unconsciously. So we don't know the reason why, but some things the brain seems to pick up very quickly, and some things the brain takes a long time to pick up. So don't worry. There are things that you still aren't able to use automatically in English. That's okay. That's not because you're doing something wrong. And it's not something you can go home and study for. You can't memorize those rules. It won't make any difference. It just takes a while for things to be acquired. We don't know why it happens, but we do know that it happens. And it happens basically for the same order for everybody who acquires English. Now, again, the orders are different in different languages, right? So Farsi has a different order. I have no idea what it is, but it has an order, but it's different from English, okay? The most important thing you understand is that this order exists, okay? That it's there and that we know that it's there, and that some things are easy and some things are late. English, because it's so popular around the world, is probably the most studied language of any language currently spoken, right? Because there are millions of people who are interested in English, and so lots of professors, lots of scholars, lots of researchers have studied English. But even they don't know why some things are acquired early and some things are acquired late. So don't worry about it. You're not going to figure it out either, but that's okay. All right. So that's our second big idea. Remember, this big idea about what's called the natural order is only for acquisition. We're talking about unconscious knowledge. I want to stress that, not conscious knowledge. You can study rules in any order and you can get 100% on the test. But acquisition is different. When you're actually speaking and listening and writing and reading, using your language automatically, let's say, that's when you're using your unconscious acquisition. And that order is determined by your brain, not by your study schedule, okay? All right. Big idea number 3. How is learning related to the way that we use language? We just talked about the natural order of acquisition. Now we're going to talk about the third big idea, which is sometimes called the monitor hypothesis. I don't know if you know that word in English, monitor, M-O-N-I-T-O-R. To monitor means to watch, to look at something, and maybe to make changes depending on what is happening. So we have an expression in English, monitor the situation. To monitor the situation means to look at it, see if it's going right. If it's not going right, you go in and you fix it. In your classroom, when you begin teaching, if you haven't begun teaching yet, when you get in front of your students, you have all these lovely students standing in front of you, right? And you're starting to teach your class, and you notice that there are a couple of students in the back of the class who are talking. Oh, that's bad, right? You as the teacher, you're monitoring the classroom. You're looking at the classroom, and if you see somebody talking and you're talking at the same time, and you want them to listen, you stop and you go, excuse me, could you listen? I'm saying something now, and you can talk later, okay? That's monitoring your classroom. You're looking at your classroom and you're figuring out what's going on, and you're correcting or making changes based on what you see. Okay, that's the verb to monitor, okay? Now, the third big idea is called the monitor hypothesis. And here's what it does. You've got this conscious knowledge in your brain, right? It's called learning, and you study the rules, you know the rules, and so forth. How do you use that learning when you actually go about speaking, listening, reading, and writing? Well, the monitor hypothesis answers that question for us. And I'm going to use a little visual here, very low tech, okay? Okay, so can everybody see that? This is your brain, right? This is your brain right here. Now, language can go into your brain in only two ways, right? How do you get language into your brain? You listen or you read. You either hear it or you see it. So your eyes and your ears are how you get language into your brain. How do you get language out of your brain? You talk, your mouth, or you write, your hands, okay? So your mouth and your hands are the way you get language out of your brain. We can give these names. Language that goes into your brain is called input, and language that goes out of your brain is called output, okay? So listening and reading are input. Speaking and writing are output. Now, this brain here, this is your acquisition. This is your unconscious knowledge. But I said we have two different kinds of knowledge, right? We also have what's called learning. Well, learning is a different part of your brain. I know this is very messy. I apologize. So this little black dot here, that's learning. That's the conscious knowledge you have in your brain. Those are the rules that you know. So here's what happens. How do you use that learning to help improve your language skills? Can you use it? And the answer is yes. Even though 99% of the time we're using our acquisition when we're speaking and when we're writing, you can also use your learning sometimes to fix your language, to make it a little better, to monitor your language. You can go in and you can fix mistakes that you haven't acquired yet, things that you haven't acquired yet. So like the third person singular S, He goes, she goes, he walks, she walks. What happens is sometimes your brain will come up with the idea, and your brain will produce your acquisition. You'll say, he walk. But before it gets out of your mouth, before you write it down, you stop and you go, wait a minute, that's wrong. It should be walks, not walk. And so you use your learning, and your learning comes in, and it fixes your output. It corrects your mistake before you say it or before you write it. Now, this is possible, and it is possible to use your learning to make your language better. We would say it's possible to monitor your output in order to fix it and make it better. That's good news, right? That means that you can actually study certain rules and you can use them to make your language better. However, we would say in English, there's a big but here. But the times that you can actually use that are very limited. There's only a small number of cases where you can actually use your learning. Why? Because in order to use your conscious knowledge, your learned rules, there are three things that you need to have. There are three, we would say, conditions for monitor use. Three things that must be there in order to use the rule. And all three have to be present. All three have to be there. The first thing, obviously, is you have to know the rule, right? You actually have to know the rule. If you don't know the rule, well, you can't use it. Now, this seems like you might think, well, that's easy. I'll just study all the rules of English. I'll go home tonight and I get my grammar book and I'm going to study all the rules of English. You think you can do that? No. Why? Well, first of all, there are lots and lots of rules in that grammar book. There are lots and lots of rules to memorize. I don't know all the rules in the grammar book. Even Amir, the great Amir, doesn't know all the rules in the grammar book, okay? And he's a smart guy, I know. He doesn't know all the rules in the grammar book. Your wonderful teacher here doesn't know all the rules in the grammar book. Nobody knows all the rules in the grammar book. It's impossible to know all the rules, okay? You can know a lot of rules, but you're never going to know all the rules. In fact, nobody knows all the rules because some of the rules we don't even know. There are rules of English right now that we don't understand, that no one has discovered. It's like a planet that nobody's seen before. There are things about English and about Farsi and about Spanish and about Chinese and about Arabic that nobody knows. We don't understand 100% of the language. So you can't possibly know all of the rules, but you can know some of the rules, okay? You can know some of them, you just can't know all of them. In fact, for most people, you can only know a small percentage of them. But let's say you know the rule. Is that enough? No, that's not enough. You have to know the rule, but also you have to have time to use the rule. Let's say I'm having a conversation. Let's say Amir and I are talking and he says something and then I say something and then he says something and I'm going to answer him. And let's say I'm speaking English and I'm a little confused and I say, now the verb should be go, it's the verb to go. Let's see, to go, first person singular is no S. Okay, I go. He, let's say, first person singular would be, or third person singular would be S, so he goes. You think we're going to be able to have a conversation? If you're stopping and thinking about the rule, that requires time. You need time to use your monitor. You need time to use your written words, which is why if you're having a conversation with someone, you can't stop every 10 seconds and think about the, wait a minute, let me think of the rule. That's not possible, right? The only time that you have time usually to use the rule is when you're writing. If you're typing an email, right, you can stop and go, let me see, is that right? No, okay. So writing is a good example of how you can use your conscious learning. You can fix your writing. Now, here's the weird thing. Even though you know the rule and you have time to use it, most people don't use the rule, even when they have time. Why? Because there's a third condition of monitor use, and that is you have to be focused on correctness. You have to be focused, your mind has to be focused consciously on how you're saying something rather than why or what you're saying. You have to be focused on how you're saying it rather than what you're saying. And that is something that most of us have a great difficulty doing. Most of us are very interested in meaning. You want to understand what a person is saying. And so when you're talking, when you're communicating, you're focused on what you're saying. You're not focused on how you're saying it. You're not focused on the rules. And we know from psychological studies that it's impossible to focus on both things at the same time. You can't focus on what you're saying and how you're saying it, the rules. You can't focus those things on the same. You can go back and forth. You can think of the what, then think of the how, then think of the what, then think of the how, but you can't do them both at the same time. And quite honestly, most people, 95% of the time, don't think about how they're saying things. They think about what they're saying. So even though you know the rule and you have time, if you're not focused on how you're doing it, you're probably not going to use it. Now, there is one case where almost everyone has all three conditions met. They know the rule, they have time to use it, and they're focused on the how. They're focused on the correctness of what they're doing. And that one case is a grammar exam. If you give your students a test in grammar and you teach them the rules and you give them time to finish their test and they're focused on the correctness because that's what the test is about, well, then they'll use their monitor. So what is grammar study good for mostly? It's mostly good for grammar tests, but it's not very good for daily communication. Why? Because normally when we're speaking or when we're listening, even when we're writing, we don't focus on the how, we focus on the what. And of course, you need time and you need to know the rule. So those three conditions are very difficult to meet. That's why even though theoretically you can use that learning to fix your writing or perhaps even to fix your speaking, it's very difficult to do it. Not impossible, but you can do it. Now, here's something that you have to understand as a teacher. You're going to become an English teacher. You're interested in English. Maybe you're really interested in grammar. You like studying English, okay? You like grammar rules. I do too, okay? I love picking up a grammar book and going, oh, really? Oh, that's interesting, okay? And your teacher does, and Amir probably does. We like it. We are a special group, language teachers. Most people, most real people, they don't love what we love, okay? We love it. You may love language. You love it. You're a teacher. That's why you're becoming a teacher, and which is great, okay? That's wonderful. We need wonderful people like you to become teachers. But you have to remember that not everyone loves grammar rules like you love grammar rules. Not everyone gets a certain excitement when they pick up a grammar book, okay? You and I, we're different. We're a little weird, okay? We're not like normal people. Normal people don't love what we love, okay? It's okay. I love it. You love it. That's good, okay? But most people are not like that. So even though you can use the rule, it doesn't mean that your students will use the rule, because you love this stuff and they don't. They just want to be able to speak English and listen to English, okay? And that leads us to our fourth big idea. The fourth big idea is called, depending on, it has different names. Usually, if you look for the five ideas about Krashen, it'll be called the input hypothesis. Remember, we talked about input and output, right? The input hypothesis. Steve Krashen, Dr. Krashen, now often calls this the comprehension hypothesis, but it's the same thing, okay? So if you see input hypothesis, it means the same thing as comprehension hypothesis. Here's what the input hypothesis says. It says, it answers a big question, okay? Remember earlier on, the first thing I talked about was acquisition versus learning, right? And the question is, how do we get acquisition? You can't get it from studying. You can't get it from your conscious knowledge. So how do you get acquisition? This is the most important question to answer tonight in this talk. How do we get acquisition? The input hypothesis gives us the answer. Here's the answer. We get acquisition. I'm going to use the verb, we acquire languages. Acquisition comes from the verb to acquire, to get. Okay, to acquire means to get. We acquire languages by getting comprehensible, understandable English, understandable language. If we can understand the language, we're going to acquire the language. We're going to understand, we're going to get it. We're going to get it into our acquisition. Acquisition comes from comprehensible input. Now, what is input? I've already talked about input, right? There are two kinds of input. Where's my? Listening and reading, okay? Listening and reading. You can listen to language and you can read language. Both of these are input. But you can't just listen and read to any language. It has to be language that's comprehensible. In other words, you have to understand it. Now, some of you there might speak Spanish, but if I were, let's say I wanted to teach you Spanish, okay? I was a Spanish teacher for a couple of years. If I speak to you in Spanish and you don't understand what I'm saying, you will not acquire Spanish. Por ejemplo, si empiezo a hablar muy rápido y hablo sobre cosas que nunca has oído en tu vida, nunca vas a aprender lo que estoy diciendo. Did you understand that? No, most of you did not understand that. If you don't understand Spanish, you probably didn't understand what I said. You could listen to me speaking Spanish like that quickly for 100 years and you'll never acquire Spanish, okay? In order to acquire Spanish or any language, you have to understand the message. You have to understand what I'm saying. Now, remember we talked about acquisition as being something that's unconscious. You don't need to do anything with your brain. All you need to do is to understand the language. And the more language you understand, the more you will acquire. Now you might think, well, Jeff, how can I, if I don't know it, how can I understand it? That's a very good question, right? If you don't know it, how are you going to be able to understand it? For example, let's take the third person singular verb S. He runs, she runs, he runs, he walks, and so forth. In order to acquire that rule unconsciously, you need to hear or read sentences that have that rule in them many, many times, okay? For many years, probably. That's comprehensible input. As long as the language contains things that you don't understand yet, rules, structures, vocabulary, that will help you acquire that language. Now, one of the expressions that we use when we talk about the input hypothesis is my high-tech chalkboard here. I plus 1. I plus 1. I is input. But input here, I means where your language is right now. Okay, so if you're a beginner, your language is here. If you're intermediate, your language is here. If you're advanced, your language is up here. Okay, I is where you are right now. In order to acquire new language unconsciously, you need to get language that has something that you a little bit above your current level, a little bit higher than where you are right now. You can still understand it. You can understand 95% of it, but there's a little bit there that you haven't acquired yet. That's the perfect environment to acquire new language. So it has to be, I usually say to my students, it has to be mostly comprehensible. Not 100%, because if it's 100% comprehensible, there's nothing left for you to acquire. Let me give the example here of vocabulary. Let's say you're reading a sentence and you understand 9 of the 10 words in the sentence, but there's one word you don't understand. However, because you know the other 9 words, you can figure out what that 10th word is, okay? So let's say the word is, I'm gonna make up a word, okay? The word is bizzle. Bizzle. It's not a real word, okay? I just made that word up. I invented that word, okay? Bizzle. But let's say you're reading a sentence. Today I got into my bizzle and I started driving. And I drove down the street and I stopped and I turned my bizzle off and I opened the door and I got out of my bizzle and I went into the store. What is a bizzle? It's a car, right? It's an automobile, or maybe it's a truck. Okay? It's something that you drive. Now, you didn't know the word bizzle when I started that sentence, when I started that example. I just taught you a new word that's not a real word, bizzle. How did you figure it out? I gave you comprehensible input. I gave you language that you can understand, and you use that language to understand the part that you didn't know before. That's what the comprehension hypothesis, the input hypothesis, is all about. We acquire language when we can understand most of the language that we're getting, but there's still a little bit we perhaps don't understand. You want to make that ratio like 95% to 5%, okay? You want to give students language that they can mostly understand. Now, how do you get them to understand it? We'll talk about that in a second, okay? But just for now, the principle you have to understand here is that we acquire languages, we get language into our acquisition system by understanding messages, by understanding language. Now, you don't speak Spanish, most of you, right? You don't speak Spanish. But I could teach you Spanish right now. I could say, hola, me llamo Jeff. Me llamo Jeff. ¿Sí? Este es mi mano. Es un mano. ¿Sí? Tengo 2 manos. ¿Sí? Un mano. 2 manos, 2 manos, un mano, 2 manos, manos. Okay, did you understand that? I hope so. If you understood what I just said, you did everything you need to do to acquire Spanish. All you have to do is understand the input, comprehensible, understandable input. That's what we want to do for our students. We want to present language in such a way that it's new, but it's understandable. They can understand what we're saying. That's what you want. You want to be comprehensible. You want your classroom to be full of comprehensible input, understandable language. If you do that, and you keep providing more, a little bit more difficult, a little bit more difficult, a little bit more difficult, eventually, slowly, okay, it takes time, slowly, your students will start to get better. They'll start to acquire the language unconsciously, and they won't even know it. They'll come to class maybe 2 or 3 weeks after you start, or a month after you start, or maybe 2 months after you start, and maybe they'll start to say 1 word or 2 words, okay? It's just like a little baby, right? A little baby, when a little baby's born, mother talks to it, hopefully the father talks to it, okay? Brother talks to it, sister talks to it. What does the baby say? Da, ba, na, 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 na. Right? Nothing. The baby can't say anything yet, but the baby is listening. The baby is acquiring language. And maybe 8 months or 12 months or 14 months later, all of a sudden, the baby will say, Mama, Papa. I'm not sure what is in Farsi. Probably something like Dada or Papa, something like that, okay? And the baby will say, you know, milk, want milk, right? The baby starts out very slowly. But during that 14 months that the baby was listening, the baby was acquiring, okay? The brain is working all the time, okay? As long as you're hearing language or reading language, your brain is working. You don't even know it's working, but it's working. And if it's getting language it can understand, which is why when you talk to a baby, right, you don't go, okay, now, Amir, what do you think about the weather today? It's kind of cold out, isn't it? No, you probably don't say that. You say things like, ball. Want the ball? Ball. You use easy language. Same for your students. Your students are like little babies, okay? They don't have anything in their acquisition. So you need to move slowly with them when you're providing comprehensible input. Also, just like a baby, it will take time before they're able to, we would say, produce output spontaneously. Remember we talked about input and output, right? Output, this side, that's speaking and writing. It takes time. There's what we call a silent period, a period between the time that you first start hearing language and the time that you're able to produce language spontaneously, automatically, without thinking about it. That silent period can take a long time depending on how much input. For a baby, it takes somewhere between, I don't know, 7, 8 months and maybe 15 months. Sometimes there are some little children that don't talk until they're 2 years old, or even 2.5, 3 years old. It's unusual. Usually they're talking by, somewhere between 8 and 15 months, but sometimes it can take a long time. That's okay. Your brain, their brains, the brains of your students, they're acquiring. Don't worry. They're acquiring as long as you're giving them comprehensible input, okay? So there is a silent period and it does take a long time. All right, 5th big idea, and then we're going to spend a few minutes talking about how you actually give students comprehensible input. 5th big idea is called the affective filter. Now, let me go back to this diagram here. It's a little messy now. Going to do a new diagram, okay? So this is your brain. and this is input, and this is output. Okay, so we have input here and output here. And input is ears and eyes, right? Reading and listening. Sometimes it's possible that some people will read a lot of English or they'll listen to a lot of English, but the brain, and it's comprehensible input, but the brain doesn't acquire it. Why? We think that for some people, there's something called an affective or emotional, if you will, filter. And this filter blocks or prevents the input from getting into your brain. Why? Maybe the person is anxious, they're nervous, or they have what we would call in English low self-esteem. They don't think they're a very good language learner. I'm not very good at this. I'm never going to do well. Maybe they have low motivation. They don't want to be in your classroom. Okay, you know, the student that sits back like this. Boring. Okay. There are lots of emotional or affective reasons why someone doesn't acquire the language that might block the input. So you give them lots of comprehensible input, but for lots of different psychological reasons, the input doesn't get into their brain. It doesn't get into their language acquisition device, we would call it. That part of your brain that is dedicated to language acquisition. A big reason, I think, why some students get this affective filter, one reason is sometimes teachers correct them too much. Every time they make a mistake, the teacher goes, oh, no, it's not that, it's this. Well, if I corrected every mistake you made, if you started speaking English to me, what would you do? Stop talking, right? I'm afraid you're going to correct my mistake. Nobody likes to be corrected. You did that wrong, okay? My wife, she's always correcting me. No, you did that wrong. Nobody wants error correction. Nobody wants to be corrected all the time. So as a teacher, you have to remember that. You don't want to, the expression we use, raise your affective filter. You don't want to get your students so nervous and so afraid that they can't even acquire the language, even if you give them good comprehensible input. That's why we want a relaxed environment in your class. You want your students to be relaxed, to be comfortable, to feel safe, okay? Not to feel nervous or anxious, because that's actually going to prevent the language from getting into their brain, okay? A big part of the affective filter, a big part of helping students is getting them to see themselves as part of the club, as part of the group. You know, some of you have hobbies, right, outside of school. Maybe some of you, I don't know, like running, right? I'm a swimmer, okay? I like to swim. I see myself as a swimmer. When I wake up in the morning and I go to the pool, I'm a swimmer. I say to myself, I'm a swimmer. That's who I am. That's part of my identity. That's who I see I am, okay? I'm an American. I'm a Californian. I'm an Irish American. My relatives are from Ireland, okay? All of these things are part of, I'm a man. All of these things are part of my identity, who I see I am, okay? It's how I identify myself. If somebody says, Amir says, could you introduce yourself? I say, sure. I'm Jeff McQuillan. I'm from Los Angeles. I'm a linguist. I'm an English teacher, okay? Those are identities. Those are things you identify with. You want your students to identify with the group of people who speak English. You want them to think of themselves as English speakers. And that way, you will lower that affective filter. Suddenly they'll be more interested and more motivated and have less anxiety in your classroom. So you want to create a little club. You are helping your students join the club of English speakers, all right? That's very important. It's important because that helps them acquire language. All right, now, how do you actually make input comprehensible? Well, I already gave you one example, and that is visuals, gestures, okay? Quickly, slowly, okay? That's a gesture. Facial expressions, happy, bad, right? Visuals, pictures. This is Japanese, picture of a Japanese, I can't see that, can you? There's a Japanese screen, okay? And this is a picture of a Sumerian necklace from Mesopotamia, from the Middle East, all right? I can sit there and I can talk about the picture. Here's a picture. This is called a necklace. A necklace, this is your neck. This is where you wear your necklace, okay? Visuals are very important in making input comprehensible. How fast you talk. Most English teachers talk too fast. Even intermediate English teachers, they talk too fast. When you talk really fast, you can't understand what the other person is saying, and that's really difficult. When you talk too fast, the other person can't understand what you say, and that's really difficult. Don't worry about your students thinking, oh, well, how will I ever understand native speakers? They saw everyone talks really fast, right? Don't worry about that. That will come with time. That will come later. First, you have to get the language into your acquisition. First, the language must be comprehensible. And to be comprehensible, you need to speak slowly, speak clearly, open your mouth, okay? Open the mouth, speak clearly and slowly. Now, you don't have to speak this slowly all the time. No, okay. But for most teachers, when I look at a teacher in their classroom, usually their teacher is speaking too fast. So slow down, don't worry, okay? Your students will understand more if you speak a little bit more slowly. Easy vocabulary, easy syntax. All of learning in general, all of education is taking what you know and relating it to something you don't know. That's education. All education is, here's what I know, here's something I don't know. I use what I know to figure out what I don't know. I apply the knowledge I know to the things I don't know. Just like in the sentence about Bizzle, right? You took the words you knew and you applied them to the word you didn't know. When you're teaching students, you need to teach them something. What? Okay. You need to pick things that they have some background knowledge about. They know something already, and you're going to give them something else. So what do your students know about? Well, it depends on how old they are, right? It depends on where they are. Do your students know something about Iranian geography? I hope so, okay? They study geography in school, right? So maybe your English lesson will be talking about the map of Iran, but in English, talking about mountains, talking about your beautiful country, talking about the desert, okay? Why is that a good topic? Geography is a great topic if students know something about it. So think about what your students know and try to talk about and give them things to read about topics that they have some knowledge about. That's called giving them background knowledge. The background knowledge makes the input comprehensible, okay? All right, one more thing. that everybody loves. Everybody loves a good story. Good language teaching should be good storytelling. Telling stories is a wonderful way to get students interested and to provide good comprehensible input. This morning, I woke up at 5:30 in the morning. I got up and I got into my car and I drove to a pool. And I went into the pool and I started swimming. There was a man, a gentleman, standing next to the pool, okay? He was standing next to the pool. And he said, "Hey, Jeff." I stopped. I said, "Yeah?" What did he say? Do you want to know what he said to me? Of course you do. That's a good story. I just made that story up. He didn't say anything to me, okay? He didn't say anything to me, but you were paying attention. I bet every one of you was listening. Every one of you was going, okay, yeah, and then what happened? That's a story. Stories provide excellent comprehensible input. Give your students good stories, either to read or just tell them a story, okay? Everything can be a story. History can be a story. Science can be a story. Art can be a story. Geography can be a story. You can make a story of lots of different things. Tell them a story in English that they already know in Farsi. They'll love it. Why? Because they'll understand it better. You can understand things in another language about a topic you understand better than about a topic you don't understand. So tell stories, lots of stories. Okay, how are we doing? Do we want to take a few, I have maybe 5 more minutes. We can take some questions.
Yeah, that'd be really great, Jeff. So first, let me just give you a round of applause on behalf of all the participants, Jeff. And we can probably also send you hearts. I mean, it's not going to cost us anything to send you virtual hearts. So thank you. So let's open the floor to our young and beginning teachers and see if they have any questions, because we have some of the veteran teachers with us too. The director of studies, Purya, is also with us here. Yolanda is also one of our most experienced teachers. She's also with us. I can see Sarah is also with us, but the rest are, I suppose, young and beginner teachers. So let's see if they have any questions. They can ask their questions. Guys, any questions? You can unmute yourselves and ask Jeff, or you can just type in the chat box. Okay, let's see. Purya, I suppose, yeah, you raised the hand. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Professor, it was great. Like always, I greatly appreciate your time. What I wanted to ask you is about natural order hypothesis. You said there's a fixed order of, let's say, learning or acquiring, better to say, things. Is it true for all different language speakers? I mean, if we consider English as, let's say, language we want to learn or acquire, this, let's say, natural order is the same in terms of difficulty or things like that for all different languages. I mean, a person who speaks Spanish has the same order of these grammatical points compared to one who has Farsi as his or her native speaker, native language.
Yeah, a wonderful, what an intelligent teacher you people have. You should be very thankful. That's
Jeff,
a beautiful
is the director
question.
of studies. Yeah.
Thank you so very much. Thank you.
Excellent question. The answer is yes. However, if you speak Spanish and you're learning English, you're going to probably acquire it more quickly than if you speak Chinese or Arabic. But the order of acquisition will still be the same, but you will move through it more quickly. Now, why? Why will someone who knows Spanish move through the order more quickly than someone who knows Farsi or someone who knows Chinese or Indonesian? The answer, you now know, is that if you speak Spanish, you're able to get, English and Spanish are more close, right, than English and Farsi, which means that the English that the Spanish person hears is more comprehensible. It's easier to get comprehensible input if you speak Spanish and are acquiring English than if you speak Farsi and acquiring English. Why? Because English and Spanish are closer together as languages, right? So I know Spanish, for example. I also know some Italian. I know some French. Okay, Italian is really easy for me. Why? Because it's very similar to Spanish. I went through the natural order in Italian much faster than the natural order in German, even though English is a Germanic language, or the natural order in, say, Chinese. I tried to learn Chinese once. Very, very difficult for me, right? So I'm going to move through the natural order more slowly because I'm getting less comprehensible input than I would if I, spoke a language that was, say, closer to Chinese. Okay, so that's the answer to the question.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Yolanda, Sarah, and Mohanna, have you got any questions? Or I know Jeff has other commitments coming after this session, so we don't have much time left. Yolanda, Sarah, or Mohanna? Yeah, Yolanda?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Hello. Dear professor, it was great, very fruitful. I just wanted to say that this is not just me. This is my daughter and I who are listening to you. Yeah, Ava is here. She's 15. She's just enjoying the meeting. Thank you so much. It was very fruitful. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Yolanda, and hello to your daughter as well. That's wonderful to hear.
Yes.
Here.
Jeff, I think we can have the last few words before we say goodbye. I personally thought, Jeff, this was the most crafted talk of yours to our audience for English teachers. And a special thanks for that. I mean, you talked about the theories in a way which was the most meaningful for language teachers. I mean, there are theories in books we read, but sometimes we are unable to find the relevance to our profession. You built that bridge tonight for us. And I, for one, am so much thankful to you. I learned a lot tonight.
Well, thank you, Amir.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, everybody, for attending tonight. And all the best to everyone. Thank you, Jeff, and have a wonderful day.
Goodbye.
Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Everyone, please write your names in the chat box, please, before leaving.
Yeah.
Type in your names in the chat box. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Sorry, I can't find the chat box. I'm on the web version of Skype.
It says chat or in call messages, something like that.